Okay, a little bit of background before we jump into this. I watched Stargate Universe when it first aired back in 2009, but I kind of found it a bit depressing and had trouble connecting with it. The tone felt almost overwhelmingly bleak, and it was such a stark, almost disconcerting contrast to SG-1 and Atlantis. So what I'm saying is, I watched it, but I wasn't really into it, you know?
Surprise.
But since the news broke that Brad Wright is in talks to create another Stargate series, I decided to go back and give SGU another shot. And I found that further removed by time from the rest of the franchise, I appreciate SGU a lot more now. But there are a few things that I have thoughts about. So I really just wanted to communicate about the communication stones. Poking around on different forums, I've seen a lot of people discuss the stones, and some people say that the stones shouldn't exist at all, that the Destiny should be totally isolated from Earth. Which, I mean, I'm fine with the existence of the stones from a storytelling perspective with the format that they've set up. Without the stones, I could have seen the writers potentially writing themselves into a corner or ending up in a situation where they would have to kill off a lot more characters than they wanted to with certain storylines. So I'm good with the stones, but I do see why total isolation would have made for a really interesting premise. I just don't think that it would have been enough to sustain an entire series, unless they would have gone back and changed other elements of the setup as well. Actually, sidebar for a second, when I first watched SGU back in 2009, I'd initially thought that they were going to do a Lost kind of thing, where there would be different mysteries embedded in the characters' backstories that would be slowly unraveled over the course of the season. And they kind of hinted at it. They mentioned that Greer had been locked up. We learned that Colonel Young and TJ had been having an affair. I'd kind of thought that maybe they would do a plotline similar to the whole one of these people isn't on the manifest situation, or that the Destiny itself might be essentially a big J.J. Abrams mystery box. And through that assumption, I had guessed that we would essentially be seeing Earth through the Lost-style flashbacks of the characters, and that would be how we would see guest stars and familiar faces and familiar settings. But nope, things did not play out that way. Alright, veering back on track here, checking in with Earth using the stones also adds an extra layer of conflict to certain situations. The Lucian Alliance planning their attack on Earth, Eli and his mom's health, Colonel Young and his impending divorce. So I'm good with the existence of the stones for storytelling purposes.
Pretty cool. Easiest way to swap consciousness with someone across the universe I've ever seen.
But my biggest question is probably not a surprise to anybody who clicked on this video. So, let's just get down to it. Are the people who use the stones okay with their colleagues using their bodies to have sex? They might be, but I don't think the show ever addressed it as something that was explicitly discussed ahead of time. Each transfer with the stones does seem to be planned. They appear to check in ahead of time, they schedule the swap, everyone on each end knows who is going to be appearing in whose body. We just never really saw that part.
You're late.
So there could have been some measure of discussion, there could have been a form, a little checkbox. We don't really know. Although, I can't imagine Chloe getting that drunk in someone else's body would be considered acceptable in any regard.
These aren't even my tears.
Okay, listen. We're about to have some real talk. So if you've made it this far in the video, we're friends now, it's fine. Let's talk about Amanda Perry.
This is the first food I've been able to feed myself since I was 9.
I feel like if a woman who had been rendered quadriplegic in an accident as a child approached another woman and said, hey, would I be able to use this technology to borrow your body in order to get with this guy that I've had a crush on forever, in what will likely be my only chance to experience that level of physical intimacy in my lifetime?
Nick, it's me. I think we both know it's a bit more complicated than that. But this is also a once-in-a-lifetime chance for me.
I feel like a lot of women, not all women by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like there is a good number who would say something to the effect of, yeah girl, get it.
Bang, bang, bangity bang, I said a bang, bang, bangity bang, 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 bangity bang, I said a bang.
Just return everything in the same state that you found it. But from my perspective, I would want to discuss it with her first. I would want to vet the situation, because that does sound like a circumstance where that type of thing would really make sense. But Amanda Perry is also a stranger in a unique situation. So follow me on this mind exercise, if you will. Think about your coworkers. Even if you're working from home, just think about the people that you work with right now. Think about the guy who you talk about hockey with at the water cooler every couple of days and you're not entirely sure what his last name is. Or think about the older lady who always brings Reese's cookies to the potluck. Now, imagine that someone is stuck on a spaceship light years from Earth and they want to swap bodies with you to have a conjugal visit with their spouse. Or they want their spouse to swap bodies with you so they can have a conjugal visit. That would be weird. I kept Googling it because I could not get this out of my head, and I found a webisode that vaguely addresses the issue, although they do never touch on it in the actual show. The webisode shows Eli interviewing a woman who is inhabiting Chloe's body, who is just really blasé about the whole thing.
Does it make you wonder, though, like what Chloe's doing right now? I mean, back on Earth.
Yeah, we signed permission forms.
And she mentions that they did sign a form consenting to the use of their bodies for personal stuff.
I hereby give consent for the temporary use of my body, blah, 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 for, personal stuff.
But even the webisode doesn't really address whether or not personal stuff includes consent for their bodies to be used for sex.
Like what? Like, does it say?
No, but folks are visiting their husbands and wives or boyfriends and girlfriends.
And they use the stones in this way as a plot point fairly early on. And considering that, unlike the rest of the franchise, Stargate Universe does depict sex scenes in more than just a fade to black context, I am really surprised that they did not address this at some point. I will say that in rewatching Stargate Universe, I did realize that this show gives the viewer a lot of credit. The show will allow characters to move from point A to point B without explicitly explaining to the audience step by step what happened. If they mention earlier in the episode that Rush is going to be doing something or other to fix the Destiny, and then you see him later doing that thing, they don't feel the need to re-explain to the viewer what's happening. They trust you to be smart enough to be able to pick up on context clues and figure out the situation on your own. So perhaps they figured that the viewers would be able to infer context from the reactions of the characters using the stones. But I think this is such a touchy subject that they probably should have addressed it directly at some point. Particularly early on in the situation with Telford, Young, and Colonel Young's wife. Because if using Telford's body in that way was a violation, then that adds a whole extra layer to the dynamic between Colonel Young and Colonel Telford. And those characters already don't get along. So that kind of muddies the water for the viewer to try and interpret based on their interactions what the significance was of that situation.
What just happened?
We just dropped out of FTL.
Looks like it might have temporarily disrupted the communication device.
We have to fix that.
What do you think? Does it matter that they didn't address essentially the rules surrounding the stones? Or are you maybe in the camp that the stones should not have existed at all? And would you use the stones? If you were on the Destiny or if you were in the SGC, would you use the stones and swap with somebody? I'm so curious. I'm like a decade late to these conversations. I've realized that despite all of the things about SGU that I like, I do have some issues with the second season. There is one storyline in particular that really just drives me up a wall, because I'm willing to submit so much suspension of disbelief about space and technology and aliens and the ancients. But when you take a very real-world circumstance and you add that into your show, and you do not have it happen the way that it would in the real world, and the characters succeed with minimal struggle, it breaks trust with the viewer, and I don't like it. This is a rant. This is a rant for another day.